Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jelena Sinanen, and I'm the co-convener of this year's Media at Sydney seminar series, which we've been running online. We're also going to run them online next year. So while there's a bit of transition into whatever next year is going to bring, and these have been going fairly well. It's been lovely to see such a good turnout. Lovely to see your cameras on. We don't ask that you have your cameras on, but it's always nice for the speaker to see somebody or at least a few people. Our speaker today, unfortunately, has camera video problems of her own, so we won't see much of her, but we'll definitely see her presentation, and we'll definitely be hearing from her. So today's quite exciting because we are hearing from our chair of department, Associate Professor Alana Mann. She is also a key researcher in the University of Sydney Environment Institute. Her research has focused on the communicative dimensions of citizen engagement, participation, and collective action in food systems planning and governance. And today's quite exciting because today she's going to be talking about the launch, and I don't want to say launch just in case that we can actually have a party at some point. So the pre-launch, the book release of her book, her forthcoming book, Food in a Changing Climate. So do feel free to keep your cameras on. I'm going to turn mine off just while Alana is presenting, just for bandwidth and recording. Please do keep yourselves on mute if you wouldn't mind. If you have any questions or discussion points, do feel free to put them in the chat and we will return to them after Alana's presentation. We are going to take a 2-minute break between Alana's presentation and the discussion, and we'll be looking to wrap up 4:30 or a little bit before. Once everybody gets zoomed out, it's pretty easy to tell. So I'm just going to ask Alana to share her screen, and we'll be looking at her presentation, and I will just say a couple of seconds of filler while Alana's screen is sharing and it goes to full screen. And without any further delay, please welcome Alana.
Thank you, Jo. And thank you everybody for being here. It's lovely to have the opportunity to talk about the book. As Jo said, it's not quite in material form yet. It's getting published in January. And so this is, a soft launch, I guess. And I'll start by acknowledging that this book was written on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the coastal people of the area we now call Sydney. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which I live and pay my respects to elders and ancestors past and present. I honour Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples' unique cultural and spiritual relationships to the land, waters and seas on land that was never ceded. And that's particularly important for the book because the way I've framed this discussion about how we eat in a changing climate involves discussing the basic relationship between food and land, which I hope we can discuss at the end of my presentation. I'd just like to start by reading a little from a chapter in the book called Framing the Future of Food, which is very much the topic of the talk today. I do say in the book that the book is not going to tell you how to eat, and it was really interesting doing the research for the book. I initially was approached by Emerald Publishing. Some people might know Emerald. They knew me through the International Association of Communication Researchers. And the lovely Jen McCall came up to me and said, you know, it's really interesting. You're a communication scholar doing work on food. What is that all about? And before long, we were having a great chat. And I said, what about, you know, talking about writing a book for the Society Now series that talks about this challenge that faces consumers in a world where we're told that our consumption practices give us so much agency. Is this really a way that we're going to, solve the problems that we're being faced with? And while I was writing the book, of course, most of it was happening during the bushfire season. So, and this was pre-COVID. So it was almost like these three culminating crises were happening while I was doing the thinking around this book. Therefore, it's been incredibly engaging, but incredibly stressful as well, because unfortunately, I think I might have read too much. I get particularly concerned about our food future, but at the same time, as I'll discuss in the talk, I'm not sure that we're approaching some of the problems the right way. So I will begin. Eating is a far more complicated behaviour than it seems. The food we eat entangles us in communities, economies, and politics, and implicates us in life-sustaining symbiotic alliances with other species. When we eat, we taste the world around us, entering into a relationship with plants, animals, and even the microbes we collaborate with to create some of our tastiest and most celebrated foods. Equally complex are the narratives that shape how and what we eat. These are increasingly sophisticated and well targeted, particularly by food producers and retailers, whose careful attention to product design, packaging, and branding is often designed to cultivate more caring relationships with the distant strangers behind our everyday eating. Many food companies claim to make us better, help us make better or healthier food choices. Relations between consumers and producers are conditioned by food labels and advertising containing icons and devices, which reflect a socio-political environment in which consumption is deemed to be an appropriate, if not a preeminent, field through which to exert influence over the ethics of the entire food system. Social and embodied food practices play a significant role, of course, in shaping our eating routines. National cuisines speak to our religious and political heritage and also serve as testament to changing climatic and ecological conditions. Food is deeply politicized, interlarded with relationships of power and privilege. Our everyday food choices reveal and reproduce relations and divisions of cultural, social, and economic capital within a broad discourse where ideologies of consumerism and citizenship shape different understandings of how food relates to equity, social justice, and sustainability. The rising popularity of vegetarian and vegan diets in weird societies, by which I mean Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic, is an expression of expanding spheres of concern with human health, animal suffering, and the environmental impacts of containment agriculture, including the effluent runoff, antibiotic discharge, and land clearing for feed crops. As Carolyn Steele says, negotiating our food-shaped world, or Citopia as she calls it, boils down to the question of how to live. Our food cultures are so embedded and intrinsic to our identities that we actually are what we eat, and the impacts of our food practices ripple through the food chain. We are agents of selection, whereby the genes, genomes, and ingredients that are propagated are the ones you prefer to eat. So every human eater slowly reformulates the planet as she consumes it. With this becomes responsibility and the weight of lives. How do we strike a balance between our own nourishment and the interests of others? This is not a solitary one-off decision, nor is it resolved in a vacuum. But can the strictest vegan protect the farm worker, or the bee for that matter, from pesticide exposure? It seems that to eat, no matter how we do it, is to kill. Or is it? The new heroes of the Anthropocene narrative include the food scientists and the biotechnologists developing novel food products in labs. Like their predecessors, the scientists responsible for genetic modification and the Green Revolution, they promise to resolve hunger. We are vulnerable to the compelling solutions offered by these and other experts, including food manufacturers, for whom the omnivore's dilemma is not so much a dilemma as an opportunity, as Michael Pollan says. It is very much in the interests of the food industry to exacerbate our anxieties about what to eat, the better to assuage them with new products. Yet, as Marion Nestle writes, can we trust an industry that promised to provide solutions to poverty and hunger in the global south, but instead concentrated on far more profitable insect and herbicide-resistant first world crops, leading to widespread misery and environmental harms? Trust, she says, requires fulfilled promises. So this book really is about the heroes and villains that abound in the fraught field of novel food products, where innovation is pitched against risk in a battlefield, including activists, farmers, scientists, and consumer groups. And there are a new clutch of entrepreneurs who suggest technology is the answer. But we might well ask, what was the question? So to move on with the presentation, I seem to, you'll find this throughout the presentation, I seem to want to have a foot in both camps, because I do think it's important. What we eat ourselves is very important. It's extremely important for our health. And it also does have an impact on many of the challenges that we're faced in a changing climate. However, I argue it is not enough to transform our food system. And I do believe that changing our food system is as much a communication challenge as anything. So what I'm looking at today is briefly the role of myth-making and narrative design in the substitutive movement. Because obviously the response to food in a changing climate, supported by many scientific studies, is that we eat too much meat and it's very bad for the planet. So what this has meant that there's been an entire plant-based push, if you like. And this has been driven very heavily through social media as well. So millennial influencers are responsible for this lovely quote that, you know, your food choices are part of living your best life. So that is how many of the novel foods that I'm going to talk about today are framed. But the context of food globally is much less sanitized, you might say. COVID has obviously problematized this incredibly. In fact, as I've been proofing the book, I've been unable to keep up with the statistics on the people who've been pushed into acute hunger. So I've given up trying. However, we can anticipate that COVID has actually demonstrated the vulnerability of global supply chains. And the problem is not only the fact that there aren't workers to pick the food or process the meat in the factories, it's also that plenty of food is getting to ports and it's unable to be delivered to markets. It's a problem of markets being closed, particularly informal markets where many of the hungry in the global south get their fresh, affordable, culturally appropriate food. So we have a situation also, of course, where we've got obesity and very high rates of diabetes. And of course, what COVID has also demonstrated is that people who have those non-communicable diseases are also extremely susceptible to the virus. So it really is a combination of crises. Now, ultra-processed foods are part of both problems. And this is because they're inextricably implicated in the fossil fuel-based industrial food system, which I'm going to talk about in more detail. Climate change is actually, as you won't be surprised to hear, the biggest threat to our food security, because it's going to change a lot of the growing patterns around the world. Interestingly enough, it's going to have a positive impact in some climates. So temporarily temperate zones, for example, might be able to produce more food, but particularly the main crops we rely on are going to experience challenges. So we have a situation where agriculture is also complicit in producing emissions. So the World Food Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization agree that food systems consume actually up to maybe 37% of available energy, largely fossil fuel based, and a lot of it post-harvest, which means that it's also in distribution and transport. So that's 70% beyond the farm gate. And it is fossil fuel based. So we clearly require widespread change, dramatic change, not just to how we eat, but how we produce food. And I have a picture here of Cuba, and I don't pretend that Cuba has a utopian food system, far from it, because anyone who's been to Cuba knows that you have a limited range of limited variety of food, and also there is significant reliance on imports because they do not have the diversity or the resources to produce it. But they offer a very interesting case, because when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, they went into what they call the special period, and they had to do this incredible widespread and rapid adaptation to a fossil-free environment. And what that meant was doing a lot of education and training and farmer-to-farmer, peer-to-peer programs, especially about how to use agroecological methods of farming as opposed to those methods that rely on fossil fuels. So there's a lot of debate currently in global policy circles about whether these agroecological methods can be scaled up to replace many of the industrial practices that are bad for our health and our food systems. So that's the sort of context for the book. And as I mentioned, it was difficult in a way to focus on any particular aspect of the crisis. So only one chapter in the book is dedicated to these novel plant-based foods. In another chapter, I talk about water, because obviously that's incredibly important in terms of our food supply, but also we face extreme challenges given that global warming is producing ocean acidification, which has all sorts of impacts that will ricochet all throughout the food web, not to mention the fact that we live in a region where many of our neighbours won't need to eat because they won't have anywhere to live when the oceans rise. So there's a bit of a focus on the Pacific. But what I really wanted to do was, as an overarching, or as my, if you like, theoretical framework, I wanted to contest this whole notion of the Anthropocene, which gives that, if you like, misleading idea of a temporal before and after, as if this just arrived. Most of us know that since Limits to Growth back in the 1970s, and before that with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in the 60s, there have been a lot of people talking about this for a long time. And so it's not such a novel crisis. And what I do in the book is I talk about how the industrial food system is actually built on an infrastructure that's still embedded in colonial foodways, and therefore it's extremely exploitative. As my organising framework in the book, I use Jem Bendel's deep adaptation agenda. So quite famously, he wrote a book about an article actually and delivered at a conference on deep adaptation. He talked about this notion of collapse. He said that societal collapse is imminent, and we had better get used to not living the way that we do now. We're going to have to do without some things. So I've borrowed from him his first 4 terms: resilience, relinquishment, restoration, and reconciliation. And I've adapted them to bring these questions into this conversation about food. So first of all, what do we want to keep? What's going to be useful when we do have to eat in a different way? And work, for those of us who work and rely on our employment in the food system. What are we going to have to give up? And this is probably the hardest thing, especially for those of us in weird societies. Restoration, how can we recover attitudes? And a lot of this goes to basically regenerating ecosystems, which is happening in a lot of countries with not only the permaculture movement, but the food sovereignty movement, all of the regen agriculture movements. Reconciliation, which is a term we use a lot in Australia. How do we make peace, if you like, with our losses and mistakes? And as people who engaged in the discussion and the consensus position in the Uluru Statement from the Heart will know reconciliation is actually not enough. We need a reckoning. How do we own and address histories of violence and exploitation that contribute to inequities in foodways? And that's really my starting point, certainly when I talk about food regime theory, which really starts with plantation agriculture. So I use Donna Haraway's, or I prefer Donna Haraway's substitution, if you like, for the Anthropocene. She talks about the Plantationocene, really fits what's happening in our foodways because it highlights how extractive practices continue, how monocultures like agricultural plantations that were embedded with exploitative labour structures basically almost provide the grid on which the modern food system is built. But what Bonaventura de Santos adds to this conversation is this notion of the lock-in of the food system not being just one of infrastructure and transport and trade and all those networks. It's also in our minds. It's a cognitive injustice. It's a refusal to be able to address and confront the injustices that are in our food systems. So I'm from Queensland. I grew up in Hervey Bay. My parents had a charter boat fishing business. No wonder I still talk about food. We were surrounded by sugarcane fields. And it's very interesting because, you know, I think it was only a couple of months ago that Prime Minister Scott Morrison said that we'd never had slavery here. And I thought, well, he's never read about blackbirding. Then he doesn't know about the fact that we actually kidnapped South Sea Islanders and brought them to Australia and then actually deported them under the White Australia policy. So when we talk about dispossession and we talk about plantation agriculture, I think we need to look at our embeddedness in an industry that still exists as well, with very detrimental impacts on particularly the Great Barrier Reef in my part of the world where I grew up, in terms of agricultural runoff and nitrogen poisoning. So that's really the lens I'm using, the Plantationocene. So moving on from that, back to today. When we talk about this problem as being of food in a changing climate, there's been, as always, an emphasis on expert opinion. And as I was reading about the literature on how we farm and food, most of it coming from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and its various authors, a lot of it goes back to this notion of a great food transformation that really emphasizes that we need to eat more plant-based diets. And a lot of the recommendations that the EAT-Lancet report, which came out in 2019, a lot of those recommendations are really common sense because they talk about basically eliminating the industrial meat industry, getting rid of the concentrated feeding operations that are the biggest proportion of the pollution and animal cruelty, certainly in the American case. And also they talk about the fact that we need to think about our health and that we need to reduce the amount of meat we eat. Americans, for example, eat double the amount of protein, and I would argue that Australians are probably close to that as well, twice the amount of protein we need. So there's definitely things we can do. So, but the EAT-Lancet reference diet, which you can see a little illustration there, has received a lot of criticism, particularly from a movement called Yes to Meat. So you'd imagine, of course, that the meat lobby will get engaged in this debate. So the EAT-Lancet used it as an opportunity to, they did a social media analysis and they looked at how this particular hashtag trended so well that it outnumbered the EAT-Lancet tweets 10-1. And EAT-Lancet came back and said, this is a really good example of how a rapidly changing media landscape and polarization pose serious challenges to science communication on health and climate issues. And they were talking about how it's so dangerous because they are actually proactively manipulating and misinforming the public about issues of fundamental importance for human health on the planet. Now, as someone who has been studying food sovereignty, did the work with the peasant farmers movement via Campesina for my PhD, and did a lot of work with farmers in Spain and Latin America, many of whom include livestock in their pluriactive setups, which means they've got very diverse small-scale farming setups. I was quite taken aback by the venom of this debate, and because of course it's just not so simple as not eating meat. So I thought, well, this is going to be something that I engage in, and a debate that I want to engage in the book. Someone who really went to town is Joanna Blythman, who some people might know if you're from the UK especially. She's probably the most outspoken investigative food journalist, and she wrote a great book called Swallow, which was all about the ultra-processed food industry and all the chemicals they put in our food. So if you want to you might change your diet if you read that book. I did. I leave a couple of things out now, but her real bugbear with the EAT-Lancet report was this plant-based protein replacement movement. So the fake meat burgers, so the Impossible burgers and the Beyond Meats, and she talked about them as being portrayed as more acceptable than a lamb chop from British hillside. Another person who many of you might read, especially on climate, is George Monbiot, who writes in The Guardian. He's particularly anti-meat as well. So she argues they want to stamp out the existing multiplicity of distinctive and diverse food cultures. And I actually agree with her about the value of those diverse food cultures, because if we deny people their diverse food cultures, then we divest them we divest them of their culture, and we cannot do that in good conscience. And a lot of the examples I put in the book are actually based on, particularly it's being published in the US as well, and they wanted me to put American content in, and I read this beautiful piece that I've repeated at length in the book, called If I Don't Eat the Moose, Is He Still My Brother?, where a female Native American talks about the importance of the moose in rituals around coming of age for young people, but also that sense that the moose is reincarnated, and by eating the moose we respect the moose, and when he returns to us, he does so having been informed about how we value him, how we basically link our own well-being to his. So it's a sense of kinship that many of us know is very familiar to Indigenous cultures globally. Apart from that angle, of course, then you've also got the cultural aspects and the social aspects of our different eating traditions. So what we know what's best for you universal diet has been largely criticised, and it's been compared to what they call the salmon and broccoli diet that has been introduced in Mexico to replace the holy trinity of beans, maize, and rice, which Mexico was self-sufficient in 40 years ago, until free trade decimated their local food economy. Now, there's no arguing that industrial meat is something we should not be supporting. For those interested in an excellent piece of ethnography, Timothy Pachuret went into a Nebraska slaughterhouse undercover for 6 months to do this research, and it's just a fascinating book, because he just talks about how people are dehumanized along with the carcasses that they process. And he talks about this notion of the fabrication department, which I love, that he says, in all political processes where the unacceptable must be rendered acceptable, where the morally and physically disgusting must be made digestible, fabrication departments, literal and allegorical, perform a dual work on construction and manufacture, and of framing forgery and the invention of legends and lies. So all these pastoral ideals that we see on these meat products, of course, belie the fact that there's a horrendously violent process behind it. Not to mention, and this has come up in COVID to the point where I just ended up getting way down the rabbit hole with this. I cannot believe the conditions that exist in the poultry processing plants. And what is amazing is largely women and largely Black women working in these processing plants. They have below minimum wages, and the industry at the moment is trying to get them to increase their work rate from 140 birds an hour to 225 birds an hour being processed to meet China, to meet China's standards. So when you talk about the race to the bottom, this is where it's happening in affluent societies. When I looked into the issue, worker organising has happened for a long time. And it was led by mostly Black women who, according to the source, represented those getting banged around the most. And this is a common story also with people who pick fruit, particularly well-known case, the tomato pickers, the coalition of Immokalee workers in the southern United States, where they work in the fields without shade, without adequate food and water, where sexual abuse is widespread, and quite simply they are actually without health care and also exposed to all of the chemicals that they use on the crops without personal protective equipment. In fact, the coalition of Immokalee workers, they had the highest rates of COVID infections in March, when it was just taking off, because they were still working in the fields without any protective equipment. So silver lining out of COVID, maybe we actually now know about these hidden atrocities. So now I want to go somewhere quite predictable. I'm going to go to the top, because I think that what we have to do when we deal with this problem, like any, is follow the money. And Tyson Foods Incorporated is one of the biggest meat companies in the world, and many of you will have heard of it. When I was in Cuba, actually, I asked the Cuban farmers what we were eating, and we were eating chicken, and I said, but you said you only produce eggs with your chickens because you can't get the grain, or you can't grow the grain to feed the meat birds. And he said to me, oh yeah, no, that is the case, but we get chicken from Tyson. And I said, but I thought you wouldn't get any imports from the US. And he said, oh no, they will give us they'll give us the cuts they don't want. So they give us the legs and the wings, the cheaper cuts, but they won't actually send them to us until we've paid in euros and the money's arrived to them. So basically there's this whole, economy where these corporations are still profiting despite embargoes, despite all these barriers. So I looked into that a bit, and it was really clear also that Tyson has an appalling environmental record. So the Gulf of Mexico is technically a dead zone now, largely due to nitrogen poisoning, much of which comes from the CAFOs, or the concentrated feeding operations. Now here we have, I guess, the fabrication departments, which include independent farm animal wellbeing advisory panels, which, according to my research, make for good publicity but offer little hope for real improvements in animal wellbeing. So the move by Tyson into the plant-based food market really is a good example of greenwashing. The publisher kept coming back to me and saying, are you sure about this? Is this fine? Have you made sure this is all documented properly? And I said, yes. So I think they're a little worried about Tyson, but I'm not the first person to complain about Tyson. So I don't feel like I have to go into witness protection. Anyway, Tyson initially invested into Beyond Meat, and the NGOs and activists who support like PETA, for example, for the prevention or the ethical treatment of animals, told him he had blood on his hands. He said it was pragmatic because he needs to know how to get his product out there on the shelves. So Tyson then divested out of Beyond Meats and created their own brand called Raised and Rooted, which is just too funny in Australia, but obviously I couldn't make a joke about that in the book. But Raised and Rooted clearly is designed to actually capitalize on this plant-based push. You can see there it's a blend of Angus beef and isolated pea protein patties. So it looks like it's going to be more sustainable than meat. What the scientists have done, an Oxford Food Governance Group have done this, Marco Springman and his team have determined that these burgers, they sit somewhere in terms of sustainability between chicken and beef. So they're actually not, they're not all they're cracked up to be. But I think what is most telling is the CEO's quote when asked about, are you going to divest out of meat then? He said, no, it's about and, not all. We remain firmly committed to our growing traditional meat business and expect to be a market leader in alternative protein, which is obviously a huge business now. So Compassion Over Killing, their response was, they're starting to take notice, but they're still not severing their ties with meat, obviously. And this is probably, the most interesting comment from my perspective in terms of the political economy of the food system. They're not self-disrupting. They're looking at where the commodities go next. And one thing that I do in the book is trace some of those commodities. One of them is soy. And it's a really good example of how foods are processed into these interchangeable commodities or foodstuffs that hardly recognizable as food anymore. They just get put into our food, into these processed products, but they have all sorts of implications on environments. For example, in the soy case, Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay make up what they call the Republic of Soy, where most of which goes to China for animal feed, actually, for the pork industry. So the soy has moved from the Amazon, where they've put in place a manifesto that prevents deforestation and the production of soy monocultures, moved to the Cerrado, which is a really important hydrological area, which actually lends itself better to monocultures because it's quite flat. It's a savanna grassland, but incredible impacts on local populations, extremely bad for the environment, had huge impact in terms of climate change, and supplementing pork industry in China, which is equally unsustainable in terms of its environmental impact, not to mention the fact that rates of obesity are also growing in China. So the implications of these different products leads me to question, okay, what's this substitution movement really doing? And Thomas Pause writes some really good stuff about this. He says the point of the substitutes is not to change the consumer habits by convincing them of accepting a new philosophy based on ethics. Quite the opposite. It's so that we don't have to change, so that we can carry on eating burgers and chicken, so we don't have to worry about making that massive cultural change that we need to in the way we operate. He talks about meat production being a symptom of a wider malaise in society. How are we going to get to the roots of this problem? And the implications of this substitution movement is also the violence of plant-based industries that rely on monocultures like soy and almonds. So almonds in particular are causing a huge issue in Australia as well, but especially California. They use about 10 times the water that apples do, for example, and they're they require a lot of bees. And the crops are also doused with a combination of herbicides and pesticides that are extremely toxic. They also destroy soil health. So when we go away from these meat diets, we need to consider not just what we're eating, but how it's produced, who benefits, and what those long-term impacts are. Thomas Pause calls this, a consequence of our fascination with what he calls headless material activism. And I also like Fred Provenz's view. Now, he's a guy who is actually a nutritionist who followed free range animals to look at what they eat and how they diversify their diets. And he has a lot to say about our food system and our health. It's a great source. He talks about ultra processed foods that ensnare us in the traps of technology. And whenever, you know, of course, we talk about this, Soylent tends to come up. Some people might remember the movie Soylent Green. If they're going to give away the fact that they were watching the movies in the 70s, it's worth looking at. I think it's Charlton Heston who's in it. In any case, the contemporary Soylent Green is a drink that kind of tastes like what's left over when you finish your cereal, and rethinks our food technology company. They reckon that it's going to totally revolutionize the way we eat, because it takes no land, uses no land, of course, and it also has very low GHG emissions. But it really doesn't say much about what we want our food future to look like if we're going to go to these technological solutions. The heart of the problem, and I am getting to the pointy end here, is that we do have this corporate food system dominated by global giants. So if we want to talk seriously about food in a changing climate, we need to address some of these issues, which include the oligopoly. Tyson, Nestle and Cargill produce emissions to rival those of the top fossil fuel companies, and the top 20 global meat producers collectively emit more GHGs than Germany. Another really big factor shaping our food systems is the supermarket, and this is really obvious in Australia, where we have the duopoly, of course. In the States, they call this particular dynamic Walmart capitalism, because the supermarkets have such power that they're actually rezoning cities, and they have a great deal of legislative power. And the person who I think talks to this the best is Davida Davison. I'm really fortunate because we have a linkage project, Food Lab Sydney, that we do in partnership with Food Lab Detroit. And I would like to read what she says because it's brilliant. We don't use the words food desert. What we use is a more appropriate term, food apartheid, meaning our neighbourhoods and our communities in the city of Detroit, and communities that have been occupied with black and brown bodies all over the country, whether it's Detroit, Harlem, the Bronx, Oakland, parts of Baltimore, DC, we live under food apartheid. A desert is a natural phenomenon, but having a lack of access to fresh, healthy, affordable food is not natural, nor is it accidental. And that's what we're finding with COVID, because City of Sydney, our partners in Food Lab Detroit and Food Lab Sydney, have given away 300,000 meals since COVID started. And before that, there were already 500,000 Australians visiting Food Bank every month. So we have hunger as well, and it's clearly a problem to do with lack of social supports and structures. So just to conclude, we must resist the neoliberal idolatry of the market. Here I get my Marxist hat on. Regulation through market choice is clearly not enough. We need regulation, because we need to manage a supply chain in which the people who produce our food actually cannot afford it. And that's especially the case for, expecting people to eat organics, expecting people to eat free range, grass-fed. It's not going to happen, because most people cannot afford to eat in that food system. So it's really a question of checking our privilege and understanding that. So basically, we have a lot of work to do to rectify our food systems. And I'm looking really forward to having some questions. Thank you very much for your patience. There's a lot of words.
Thank you so much, Alana. That was such a full 45 minutes. I'm sure we all have many questions and comments that we would like to make. Yes, Pam, please go ahead.
I have to ask Alana this because I really want to eat almonds, and it worried me when she told me about how they're produced and what to do. So what's the best way that I can access that food that I feel is necessary for me at the moment without, you know, it was shocking what you told me about the way that they're grown and what they do.
Yeah.
So what options do I have?
Yeah, what they're doing is, because it's such a big problem, like in the States, I couldn't believe it when I read that they lost something like 30% of their bee population last winter. Like, I mean, it's just amazing. And they transport the bees, the hives, across the country to service the almond industry, right? It's not all almonds that are at fault, obviously, but the colony collapse disorder, which you've probably heard of, which is really quite mysterious. It's been linked to, you know, all these glyphosate and all these chemicals that they spray. But it's such a big problem now that they started this Be Better certification program. So at least in America, there's a certification of almonds that are actually raised in different conditions that have more of that natural biodynamic environment. So what you have to do is you have to do research and find out, well, what are the brands that, where there are varieties as well. Different varieties don't require as many inputs. And I don't know any off the top of my head, Pam, but I'm really happy to investigate it with you, because I'm with you. You know, I'm the same with seafood. You know, and it just kills me because it's so hard to be good when it comes to fish. And then you read stocks declining and you think, what how am I going to do this? And this is why I think it's such a little understood area, you know, and we need to be better at helping people make the right choices. Because one of the things I talk about in the book, and this is to do with the food apartheid, people don't actually, you know, spend a lot of time or have a lot of time to spend. They usually go shopping on their way to between work and school or something like that. How much effort have you got to put, how much time have you got to put into those decisions? But there's definitely a few other varieties that aren't as bad for bees. And yeah, but yeah, I'm sorry about that. Sorry about your almonds.
Takes work. Well, I grow all my own veggies where I can, so I do try and do things like that, but you know, not enough land to grow almond trees as well.
No, that's exactly right. Well, you know, you're a good example of someone who's got that really rich Italian food culture where you actually grew your own food. So you actually, you know, probably still close to that, whereas a lot of people are like several generations away from that, you know, and they don't have that option either, you know. I get the feeling I'm not going to be able to solve everybody's problems if they've got questions about what they should eat. I'm more of a pain in the neck. Any other questions? Or comments, or take me to task. I was really careful about the vegan argument, actually, I must admit. I had a bit of an altercation with a friend on or a colleague, actually, a male colleague who you know, he's a vegan. We were really good friends, and he accused me of being aligned with the corporate meat industry because I said that I still eat meat. And I said, well, actually, no, but I'm really fussy about what meat I eat. And yeah, it's tough. Food is very political.
Sharon, please go ahead.
And this is more of a comment, I suppose, but it comes from what Pam was saying. But I was thinking about the beef kind of, I guess, cruelty to bees by shifting them around would make it the almonds non-vegan. But also in that comment about millennials living their best life and whether keto sort of fits into that as well. Those two lifestyle choices can, in a perverse way, be
yeah. It's a really good comment, Sharon, and I think it's really true. There's this huge movement, you know, around healthism, as they call it, and related to lifestyleism, which is this idea of the clean eating and the clean foods. And it's just this there's a great book about purity by Alex Shotwell. Really recommend it, because she talks about how all of our diets, exactly as you said in the case of the almonds, how is the vegan maintaining that ethic if they do eat almonds. And she talks about how all of our foodways are, you know, contaminated, and to an extent we need to be a little easier on ourselves at the same time, that we cannot be pure. So her book, that's what it's called, Against Purity. It's absolutely brilliant if you're interested in it. It's beautiful, not just about food, just about the pressure again on people to be living their best life, basically. Like, what does that even mean? And who are you living it for?
Thanks for that response, Alana. I just have a question that's been sent through by Sonia. Sonia says, I wonder what you think of businesses like Trader Joe's, Harvest Box or Butcher Box, where their business model and appeal is based in sourcing sustainable and organic food. Is it a step in the right direction, or is it possible that it's maybe another manifestation of green capitalism and healthism?
Great. Yeah, really good question. I do think it does produce what they call those, Julie Guthman's works great on this too. She wrote a book called Weighing In, and she talks about this idea of, you know, putting so much pressure on people, it becomes, you know, as if it's a lifestyle choice to eat this way. She talks about the creation of the ethical enclaves that you actually end up through these sort of, you know, community supported agriculture programs where you do get your box scheme, and the organic movement itself. It's again, by pandering to the market, it's sort of produced this environment where you have to pay to eat well, or pay to eat without chemicals, and everybody else can, you know, basically go be damned. Jill Harrison writes about it in relation to pesticide drift in California, and it's really interesting because she says that the community supported agriculture movement, which is, you know, linked to those box schemes you're talking about, that idea of connecting growers and consumers in really short supply chains direct to the farmer, get the farmer a better return at the farm gate, etc. She talks about those as being part of really kind of a movement in the civil rights era. For example, community supported agriculture was all about wages as well, and it was all about food workers and farm workers. And she said that it's really shifted in the last couple of decades back to focus on the consumer. So these days, when you talk about pesticides, you're more worried about, you know, what's actually residual on the product that you buy, rather than how did it affect the person or the environment in which it was grown, you know. So it's really a different mindset. And it seems to go back to this sort of, you know, as I call it in the book, and this isn't my term, but I like it, it's this small p politics, political consumerism. Yeah, it's not, you know, you're not going to change the food system by voting with your wallets. Having said that, of course, if you're engaged in one of those networks, and a good example is in Brisbane, Food Connect, Rob Pekin, very great entrepreneur. He and his partner, Emma Kate Rose, were dairy farmers. And about 10 years ago, they set up this veggie box delivery scheme. And basically they crowdsourced $1 million and purchased a huge warehouse. And they demonstrate how you have to pay attention to lives all along the supply chain. So what they're doing is they're focusing on, you know, ethical production systems, giving farmers, you know, a fair wage for what they produce, but they're also employing local warehouse. They've got attention to every detail along the supply chain to make sure that it's, you know, that it's not discriminatory. But they don't make a lot of money. It's like a social enterprise, but it's doing food for purpose as well as profit. You know, it's about making sure that you're doing good food for the right reasons.
That leads into a comment that Margaret has. So we've got Margaret, then Margie, then Penny. Go ahead, Margaret.
Hi, Alana. That was absolutely fascinating today. I was really taken by your food apartheid example from Detroit and other places in the United States. And I guess what it reminds me of is, you know, a number of experiences, I guess, in lower socioeconomic areas where, you know, clearly availability of good, clean, fresh food. And I'm just thinking of, you know, last year just being in some shops in the western suburbs of Alice Springs in Australia, or even out in Western Sydney, Tregear, Emerton, Mount Druitt, those places, that we really have got this divide going on still. So
yes.
It's a divide around many things, but food is just yet another example.
Yeah, it's a really big one. You know, it is very clear, you know, in the US, but I agree, Margaret, it's very clear here. I remember watching Struggle Street. You remember that show on SBS? And straight away I noticed what they were having for lunch, and I kind of looked into it because it was around one of the areas where quite a few of our food lab participants come from, and it was St. Mary's, I think. And the only way you could get anywhere to buy fresh food was to get in a car. So if you didn't have a car, you were basically walking along the highway and going to the Caltex and buying some sandwiches out of the fridge. And that was basically what people were eating on that show. And it's a really good example of how zoning impacts on you know, people's food choices, and also on how dangerous it is not to have a really diverse, participatory, culturally diverse food system. You know, you've got to have culturally appropriate food for people, and having big retailers in malls where you have to drive to, that's such a destructive model when it comes to, you know, getting people to participate in the economy, let alone eat well. Yeah. Detroit's really interesting because when Davida visited here, we were walking down Redfern Street, and I said, oh, you know, it's so different from Detroit here, obviously, because, you know, their city went bankrupt in 2011, and they had all these vacant lots where they started growing a lot of food. So they had really strong urban agriculture, and they were cooking out of their kitchen, and it was a grassroots movement. It was African American women, you know, selling food because all the retailers had moved out. But she looked at me and she looked around, she said, you know what, this area isn't that different. She said the same thing started happening. It started gentrifying. Restaurants and cafes popping up that local people couldn't afford to eat at. And she said that is another symptom of you know, what's happening with the, I guess, the concentration of power and money in the food system. You know, it becomes really exclusionary. It's so hard for people to actually participate in it. Yeah, so it's really interesting seeing how different cities how this manifests in different places.
Margie has a, oops, did I hear the noise? Nope.
Hello.
Margie has
Hi,
a
Alana.
Hi, Margie. So nice to see you.
Great to hear you. I have two questions, actually. And one has to do about the place of markets and the in this discussion. And the other is to do about style of communication. And maybe I'll talk about the style of communication one first. Is you were talking about that like hashtag kind of war that went on. So I've seen those, and I've seen definitely, you know, people who are getting their message out, and they're clearly aligned with some kind of industry, or so, you know, they're all kind. It's a kind of lobby. It's not really an honest conversation around, you know, meat and individual food choices versus conversations about food security. And it strikes me that is one of the problems here, is that there's kind of two conversations going on at once because they're entwined. So I've seen that kind of thing. And then there's also I actually pulled up a few on my computer. There's you know, a particular kind of journalism that is structured around, here's something that you like, and here's why you're kind of an idiot for doing that. So there's lay off the almond milk, you ignorant hipsters. Can vegans stomach the unpalatable truth about quinoa? And it's actually become a kind of way of structuring really important stories about food security, that my concern is that they sometimes just make people feel like they can't get involved in this discussion. So that's all a kind of a lot of backstory to say, do you have examples of how we're getting this conversation right? So that's my first question. I'll let you answer that one first.
Yeah. That's a really, really good, I think that's a really good analysis. You could have been doing some research for me. They're good examples. The quinoa one's really interesting. Did you mention quinoa?
Yeah, that's the vegan stomach, the unpalatable truth. And then there's the PETA response. And there's it's a way that it sort of works really well as they're very good kinds of news feature stories, right? But they strike me as both productive and unproductive.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I think this is a little bit of an example of the polarization that we see in so many issues. It's almost like there's not a safe space to have the conversation, because you do get these really vitriolic and you know, I when I was reading about veganism, it was really interesting because there's been a lot of you know, a lot of criticisms of vegans that I was quite surprised about, that I didn't know. Just like the EAT-Lancet report, the vegan movement has also been subjected to this sort of, you know, backlash about being, you know, not only blind, I guess, to privilege, but also blind to colour. You know, vegans have been being accused of, and I'm just quoting here from Jennifer Polish, who writes about this, of being blind to the fact that the very category of human is not universal, rather just as contentious as the category of animals. So she was talking about the missteps, like Peter did this really tone deaf "Are Animals the New Slaves" exhibition, you know what I mean? Just like very clueless, and Twitter campaigns like #AllLionsMatter, you know, this sort of, you know, which just honestly, you know, and my response to it, and I read this because I started reading about, you know, there are a lot of vegans of color, and particularly again in the US, a lot of Black women were using veganism as a way to decolonize, if you like, their own eating habits and their bodies from a colonial diet, because colonial Black and brown people shit food. Like the stuff I was reading about what they eat in the Pacific, the reason Pacific Islanders have such bad health problems is they get all the fatty mutton flaps and stuff from New Zealand and Australia, because we don't eat it. So we send it to them. So it's just so racist. It's so, you know, land and labour relationships in the food system are still so racialized. So the way I went, sort of negotiated it, was dealing on Anna Hawk Singh's work. A lot of people probably know her. She wrote this fantastic book recently called The Mushroom at the End of the World, where she looks at, you know, how different economies and industries emerge out of the cracks of capitalism. So she uses a Matsuki mushroom. Is that how you say it? Matsuki mushroom as her little motif. But she also talks about the friction in social movements. So the conversation, for example, in veganism, it's so wide and various, and you know, it has this negotiation of conflicts internal as well as external. So I think within the movements themselves, within groups of people who have different eating lifestyles, I think they're having quite civilized conversations about this. You know, it's just when you get this, you know, sort of, you know, no legs good, four legs bad thing, you know, where like, well, all meat is bad, you know, or as you said, and as Pam was grappling with, all almonds are bad. It's not true, you know, and all quinoa is not bad, because of course quinoa's had a huge, you know, sort of moment, just like you know, all sorts of superfoods as they're called, and it has huge sustainability challenges where it's grown. Yeah. So I think that in terms of having a conversation and communicating well, I do think that a lot of the ethical trade products are actually doing a good job of communicating simply because they're providing information. And I think that is the challenge. It's actually capturing people's attention enough to explain something really complex, but it's the challenge that we all face with in the media, in a really busy media scape. And I'd love anybody to have to drop in there and comment on that, because I know it's a bit of a, it's a bit of a cop out to just say, well, it's, it's social media tribalism, but it does get extremely virulent. And that was why I said in the book, I'm not going to tell you how to eat, because everyone's food politics and food preferences are so personal and sensitive. And I think it sort of loses the bigger picture about the fact that, you can have a diet that's quite sort of, I guess, if you like, affordable, and one that people might frown on if you've got to feed your family and you've got to occasionally buy products that don't fit these really strict ethical guidelines, but you might still be aware of and be taking action in other areas of the food system to make sure that you're, doing your bit. But again, it's always about coming back on us, what we're going to do. I just see governments just buying into this corporate food regime, and they won't challenge it. The Grocery Code of Conduct in 2017 exposed that Coles and Woolworths were pushing back all their marketing costs onto farmers. And what happens to them? They're the heroes now in COVID, because they've, given us lots of toilet paper, and their profits are up 18% this quarter. Sorry, I don't like the supermarkets much.
Well, could I maybe then ask my question about farmers markets? Because of course, the minute you bring up farmers markets, it sounds like a sort of nice, middle class thing to do. But I wonder how important farmers markets are in creating a diverse kind of food security. And I might add that I am the granddaughter of a farmer who started out as a market gardener selling in Canada, but would sell at the Eastern markets in Detroit. And over the course of his farming career, went from a diverse garden to 2 crops, cucumbers and tomatoes. So you see this change that went on, and we see this kind of return to the much more diverse market garden. And in Sydney, we're so lucky to still have so many market gardens ringing the city, yet they're all being developed. So I wonder whether farmers markets have a political place as well as just being a kind of nice thing. And if you want to talk about that, maybe in Australia rather than even globally.
Yeah, sure. It's it's really a good issue. And I think that farmers markets, of course, we are lucky in Australia and Sydney itself. Like, if you think of the diversity of farmers markets, like, yes, there is the extremely sort of more privileged markets in the inner city, perhaps, like, Everleigh, for example, in Newtown or Camperdown. But there's also, of course, all the diverse markets that were brought over by people who actually came to this country with that sort of background that you're talking about, growing a market garden. So if you go to Bankstown, you find everybody at the veggie market, and it's not like it's some sort of Saturday morning, nice place to go and get your flat white. It's and take your dog. It's really about getting the food that you need every day. And I think they're really important, because like urban agriculture, it's not going to feed everybody, but it brings us back in touch with the fact that food comes from somewhere. And that's been a big argument from a lot of the food sovereignty movement, because they say food from somewhere is better than food from nowhere. And at the moment, if you go to the supermarket, food comes from who knows where, and its production hurts who knows who. So farmers markets are really important, but the peri-urban agriculture problem is a huge one. And I know that in Canada, for example, I know some people at Simon Fraser, they were telling me about the great land grant system they've got in British Columbia, where they actually are not allowed to develop land. It's got to be kept for farming. And that's what I think we need to do in Australia, because, you know, even in Melbourne, they expanded the cemetery and got rid of some of the market gardens. You know, I've got a colleague who's been doing great work on that. So really important, especially COVID's shown us, you know, like we're lucky. In Australia, we get 75% of our fresh food from our own country. But there are a lot of countries where they rely, obviously, on imports of fresh food. And they're going to be the worst to come out of this, because hunger is just going to be so much more worse than the virus for some countries. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, Margie.
So we'll have Penny, who's been waiting a while, and so has Agatha. And then we're running slightly short of time. So unless anyone has any burning questions, we'll have Penny, then Alana respond, Agatha and Alana respond. So we have enough time for both of their comments.
Thanks, Jolina, and thanks, Alana. Wow, what a great presentation. I just want to pick up on what seems to be a bit of a tension, an interesting tension in the theorization of what you're doing, which is, on the one hand, this very strong political economy analysis of food chains and agribusiness and so on, and also the resistance to that and the many sort of types of resistance. And then that sort of overlaps with this sort of quite interesting sense, almost uniform, that solutions are really culturally located and developed through sort of autonomous or strategic kinds of initiatives. But what I'm getting at is there seems to be a bit of a tension between the political economy sort of framing and what would be more a kind of cultural studies sort of interest, which seems to be, so you've sort of got causes and the solutions sort of almost in two parallel kind of theorization.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, Penny. And it is a tension because, and I think it goes to that local, global, you know, micro, macro as well, because I do believe the solutions to this, as you say, it is a contradiction, because I believe they're locally based. I believe food systems need to focus on where we live, because, you know, that's where it starts. You've got to be part of a food system. You've got to feel like you participate. You've got to feel like you have some sense of governance in it. But at the same time, one of the reasons why, for example, the food sovereignty movement took off was because those local networks of farmers and consumers just felt that governments did not care about them anymore, because they were interested more in this global food system, which was very much about this free trade, you know, neoliberal free trade discourse. So what you do have is it's a bit like climate change as well. Unfortunately, you know, it's not going to work if Sydney's the only city in the world that worries about climate change. It's like that with the food system. So I think what we have to do is we have to have that sort of sandwich strategy where you sort of, you know, we've got to push for changes in policy, and we've got to focus on municipal government policy too. And I think that's where it's really powerful, because the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact is something I talk about in the book, which is a network of about 210 cities. And what they're doing is working on locally based food solutions, open source, in terms of ideas. Where's the creativity coming from? You know, but at the same time, that's going to be really, really challenging, especially, you know, for people who are the most vulnerable to climate change. It's going to be really hard to wait for all that to catch up, all that growth from below if we don't put some rules in place. And again, I think that, you know, you can look away and ignore the corporate food system to an extent until it really starts screwing the planet, which it is doing now. It's part of that. So what I do in the book is actually spend quite a lot of time talking about the fact that we've just got to leave fossil fuels in the ground, or all of this is pointless. And I don't think individuals can do that. So we're going to have to, you know, make a large scale cultural shift. And this is why I used the collapse, you know, the collapse theory. I don't like the word collapse because it sounds really dramatic, but I do think we're going to have to just realize our lives are going to change dramatically. And then, hello, look what happens, COVID. It's like, you know, this is an example of what you have to do, large scale, drastic change. Yeah. But that's great thinking. I'd love to talk to you about it further and get more from you on that. Thanks, Penny.
Got to run and do the internship skills test. So.
Of course you do.
Go
Thanks,
ahead, Zata.
Pod. See ya.
Hello. I'm guessing I go ahead with my question.
Hello. How are you, Agatha?
I'm good. I'm feeling a bit awkward here because I think I'm the only vegan in the room, possibly. And I think what you were saying was a great presentation, is very familiar for me already. Some of the debates that you talk about, and especially the decolonization for Black people in America. There's quite a few that I follow that are trying to, push. A lot of people have complained that they're being excluded from the vegan movement for not being white enough, which I've seen repeatedly. But I guess the main kind of comment or question that I've got is, and I see it a lot, is real big push for the plant-based meat alternatives that are being promoted everywhere. It seems to be a reinforcement of this whole belief that a meal is not a meal unless you have meat in it, which I've never understood as a vegan. Like, I understand that it's kind of like the convenience factor of, well, if we want people to feel like they're making a more sustainable choice, but we don't want you to give up what you're most comfortable with or what forms such a strong part of your cultural identity. I mean, my cultural background, I'm Polish. Try being Polish and so vegan in Poland. That's a fun experience.
I bet.
It's not as bad as being vegan in Hungary, but it's more. And also, I lived in Spain for 3 years, and they're also really passionate about, especially pork, because of the whole Muslim background. 1,000 years ago, they're still holding a grudge about that. So it's all about the pork. And it's always this thing of people freaking out and feeling like they're personally attacked when I say that I'm vegan, which I think is where a lot of the criticism comes from. But it's at the same time, a lot of the criticism I'm seeing for the plant-based alternatives, and I agree with them, is that they're not really an alternative. You're just trying to create the same product.
Yeah.
I used to, when they're talking about, I mentioned before as well, the cultural diversity of foods that is being lost when you're trying to grow a monoculture. But so many, even countries like Poland and Spain, they have so many foods that are vegan by default. There are so many staples that they eat, like lentils and chickpeas, that kind of just get pushed to the side for this new fad that's going to replace the meat in your diet. And I'm just wondering how much research is going into addressing that.
That is such a great point. And that was probably one of my favorite, kind of dilemmas, because the naming of the products has been really controversial. Like in the US, they've stopped, people using meat, burger, sausage, jerky, hot dog, all those terms in about 30 states, because they say, oh, you're trying to, just muscle in on the meat market. Whereas a lot of people said, we shouldn't be calling them that, because that perpetuates what you said, which is sort of this gold standard for meat. So meat's the king and everything else is secondary. And that's really important. And as you said too, a lot of the researchers who are looking at the sustainability credentials of different foods say the bean patty, like, why do we need this ultra processed product thing on the planet? And it's cheap and it's easy to produce. Why don't we focus on what we have, leave them unprocessed, like you were talking about lentils again? It's this, again, this corporate profiteering through the creation of new products that are actually still really destructive for the environment because they contain all of these numbers and we don't even know what they are, but they're definitely part of the problem. But that is a really great comment, Agata, and I'd love to talk to you offline sometime, not just because you're a vegan, but because you've really thought about it and you really get it, and it's something that I'd love to, you know, look at further. And I could learn a lot from you. So I'll buy you a coffee.
Happy to, if we're allowed to do coffees anyway.
Oat milk.
Black coffee, no sugar, and I have since I was 10 years old. I've never liked milk, which helps when
you're winning.
Well, directions for future conversation is...
We must be nearly at time. Sorry, Joe, go ahead.
If there aren't any more questions, directions for future conversations is an excellent place to leave it. So please join me in the virtual sort of applause when I find my, there we go, sound effect. Thank you so much, Alana, and huge congratulations on the book, and we look forward to actual launch at some point when we can. And thank you everybody for being able to sit in this afternoon.
Fantastic. Well, I have enjoyed it so much. It's so nice to be indulged, to be able to just crap on about what you really are passionate about for an hour and a half. So thank you, everybody. Great questions. You're so great to come along and listen for so long. And thank you, Joe, for hosting so gracefully and for sorting out all the technology. See you later. Next time.